President Trump turned to Canada in the hope of easing restrictions on LNG exports. Prime Minister Carney's response: not concession, but a clear turn toward Asia, placing the United States on the defensive, both economically and politically. Today we will break down three key movements in this unfolding story. First is the sharp and almost unbelievable decline in energy flows from Canada to the United States. Second is Prime Minister Carney's $116 billion nation-building strategy designed to function largely without reliance on the US market. And third is the geopolitical shockwave these changes send through President Trump's 2026 plans. Let us examine the details. So what exactly has just happened? This needs to be clarified because many major media outlets are overlooking the most critical links in the chain. On January 10, 2026, Canada completed its first large-scale LNG export shipment directly to Asia from the Kitimat facility in British Columbia. This roughly $40 billion project has been more than a decade in the making. The LNG carrier Glasgow departed port bound for South Korea, formally ushering Canada into the ranks of major LNG suppliers to the Asian market. This was not a symbolic gesture for appearance's sake. It marked the beginning of a profound restructuring of Canada's energy strategy, and it is precisely this point that has caused the greatest concern within the Trump administration. Canada's natural gas exports to the United States have declined significantly. According to data released just days ago by Industrial Info Resources, in January 2025, Canada was still exporting an average of roughly 9 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day to the US. By the end of last week, however, that figure had fallen to just about 5.4 billion cubic feet per day, representing a nearly 40% drop in less than a year. It is worth restating these figures to fully grasp the scale of the shift. The volume of natural gas Canada sells to the United States has fallen from 9 billion to 5.4 billion cubic feet per day. This is not a technical adjustment or a temporary fluctuation, but clear evidence of a deliberate and long-term strategic realignment. This represents a calculated step back from the US market. At the same time, Statistics Canada reported that the total value of Canada's energy exports in October 2025 fell by 12.4% compared with the same month a year earlier. Heavy crude oil exports in particular, an area in which Canada is the largest supplier to the United States, at roughly 4 million barrels per day, accounting for nearly 60% of Canada's total overseas oil exports, declined by almost 19%. And the reality on the ground is even more troubling. This downturn has unfolded precisely as the tariff war initiated by President Trump against Canada has continued to escalate. In 2025, the US president imposed tariffs of up to 35% on most Canadian goods, with energy products facing a separate tariff of around 10%. President Trump's tactic has been relatively straightforward: use tariffs as a tool of pressure to force Canada into concessions on issues ranging from border security and trade provisions to energy supply. But Prime Minister Carney saw through and exposed that calculation. Rather than retreat, the Canadian Prime Minister announced a deliberate roadmap to cut Canada's trade dependence on the United States by half over the next 10 years. More importantly, this was not merely rhetorical. The strategy is underpinned by the most ambitious energy diversification program Canada has ever pursued, a plan that is already operational and generating real revenues from Asian markets beyond President Trump's reach. To fully understand this, one must look at how Carney is executing a disciplined and effective economic counteroffensive. At the center of this strategy is the LNG Canada complex in Kitimat, widely regarded as one of the cleanest liquefaction facilities in the world within its class, with emissions roughly 35% lower than those of today's most efficient comparable plants. The project brings together major players such as Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Korea Gas Corporation. These are not minor partners. It is an alliance of leading global energy companies representing vast and stable demand from Asia. And here is the key figure to watch. In its first phase alone, LNG Canada has the capacity to export approximately 14 million tons of liquefied natural gas per year. The project's second phase, expected to receive formal investor approval in 2026, will double that capacity to around 28 million tons annually. Converted for clarity, this equates to nearly 3.7 billion cubic feet per day at full operation, a substantial share of the natural gas volumes Canada previously sold to the United States. And Prime Minister Carney is not stopping there. In November 2025, He went on to announce a second wave of projects under what he has termed the nation-building initiatives through Canada's Major Projects Office. These 7 new projects, combined with 5 announced the previous September, form an investment package worth approximately $116 billion. Among them is the Case Elysium liquefaction plant, designed to become Canada's second-largest LNG export terminal with a capacity of roughly 12 million tons per year, all of it targeted at Asian markets. To grasp the full economic significance, these figures must be viewed side by side. At present, Canada is still exporting roughly 8.6 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day to the United States. However, as the LNG Canada complex comes fully online and the Case Elysium project proceeds as planned, Ottawa will be in a position to redirect a substantial portion of that supply toward Asia, where LNG prices are typically 30 to 40% higher than in the North American market. This is precisely what makes the issue so sensitive for President Trump, as U.S. demand for natural gas is rising rapidly. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, American dry natural gas production in 2026 is projected to average about 109.1 billion cubic feet per day, an increase of just 1.3% compared with 2025. This growth rate is far below the average annual increase of 4.3% recorded since 2024. In other words, U.S. gas production is slowing at exactly the moment when demand is surging from data centers, artificial intelligence applications, and LNG export terminals. The United States is currently experiencing a powerful wave of LNG export expansion, particularly in Texas and Louisiana, where multiple new facilities are coming online. But there is a critical constraint. These facilities all require feed gas, and they must compete directly with domestic industries, power generators, and consumers for supply. As Canada reduces its gas exports from levels close to 9 billion cubic feet per day to significantly lower volumes, upward pressure on U.S. natural gas prices becomes difficult to avoid. According to EIA forecasts, the U.S. benchmark Henry Hub gas price could average around $3.90 per million BTU in 2026, a sharp increase from roughly $2 in 2024. Bloomberg has outlined an even more aggressive scenario, estimating prices could range between $4.50 and $5 by late 2025. One of the drivers behind this upward trend is the decline in imported supply from Canada. And to understand why this matters so much, it is worth revisiting comparable historical precedents. The current situation recalls the oil crisis of the 1970s, but in a completely inverted form. At that time, oil-producing countries in the Middle East curtailed supply to exert geopolitical pressure on the West. Today, Canada, the United States' largest trading partner and the most reliable energy supplier America has ever had, is using market diversification as a strategic tool to counter tariff threats from the Trump administration. The chain reaction is straightforward. President Trump imposed 35% tariffs on Canadian goods. Ottawa did not respond with rhetoric, but with action, accelerating the construction and operation of liquefied natural gas export infrastructure aimed at Asia. Asian countries, already seeking stable supplies after Russia weaponized energy in Europe, moved quickly to sign long-term contracts. The result is that Canadian producers now have more attractive alternative markets, while the role of the United States in this equation continues to diminish. This situation can be understood through a simple, everyday analogy. For many years, you buy groceries from a neighbor because the prices are reasonable and the arrangement is convenient for both sides. Then one day, you begin demanding that they do extra work for you for free while threatening to stop buying from them if they refuse. Instead of giving in, the neighbor opens their own stall, attracts customers from everywhere, and finds buyers willing to pay full price or even more for the same products. In a short time, the balance of power flips. The one who once applied pressure becomes the dependent party. That is exactly what is now happening in reality. Beneath these developments lie very specific technical factors. A roughly 670-kilometer coastal pipeline now directly connects natural gas fields in Western Canada to the export terminal at Kitimat. This system does not follow the traditional southbound pipeline routes designed to serve the U.S. market. It completely bypasses the old axis of dependence and stands as the clearest physical proof of Canada's strategic pivot in the energy sector. Gas flows are now genuinely moving westward toward Asia, rather than south into the North American market. And it is this reversal that is generating far-reaching consequences, affecting multiple layers of American society. Those who will feel it most acutely are U.S. workers and families, through their monthly electricity and heating bills. Natural gas is currently used to heat roughly 47% of households in the United States. When gas imports from Canada fall by as much as 40% and domestic prices rise, exactly as projected by the EIA, the impact becomes immediate and tangible. A household in Michigan or Minnesota, where winters are long and harsh, could see heating costs rise by 25 to 30% in 2026 compared with 2024 levels. These are not speculative or emotional estimates. They are calculated based on current price scenarios. For families already struggling with rising living costs, having to spend an additional $50 to $100 per month on heating during the winter represents a significant burden. Manufacturing workers face a different kind of risk. Natural gas is not only used for heating, it is also a critical input for the chemicals, plastics, fertilizer, and steel industries. Major corporations such as Dow Chemical and ExxonMobil Chemical operate massive petrochemical complexes along the U.S. Gulf Coast, and their entire business model is built on access to cheap natural gas. When gas prices rise from around $2 to $4 per million BTU, profit margins are quickly eroded. Some plants begin to lose economic viability. The knock-on effects include production cuts, reduced shifts, and ultimately layoffs. Small businesses, particularly energy-intensive operations, are finding themselves caught in the middle. Consider a concrete example: a small metal fabrication shop in Ohio with around 35 employees, using natural gas both to heat its facility and for certain production processes. When energy costs surge, the business cannot easily pass those costs on to customers, yet it also lacks the financial cushion to absorb them over an extended period. The owner, let us call him Mike, has seen his natural gas bills double between 2024 and early 2026. Profit margins that were already thin have effectively vanished. He cannot readily shift the higher costs onto customers, because larger competitors continue to operate under long-term contracts signed earlier, at much lower energy prices. Mike now faces a series of painful choices: laying off staff, cutting working hours, or, in the worst-case scenario, shutting down the workshop altogether. And his story is far from unique. If Mike's situation is multiplied across thousands of small manufacturing businesses spread throughout the Midwest and the Northeastern Industrial Belt, a picture emerges of a quietly expanding wave of risk. Even large corporations are not immune to these concerns. Industrial giants such as Nucor Corporation and U.S. Steel have openly cited natural gas price volatility as a significant risk factor during recent earnings calls. U.S. Steel in particular emphasized in its fourth quarter 2025 financial report that Canada's reduction in energy exports has increased price uncertainty, thereby threatening the competitiveness of domestic steel manufacturing. Meanwhile, utility companies are being forced to respond quickly. Duke Energy and Southern Company both announced in late 2025 that they are accelerating investments in renewable energy, largely because persistently high natural gas prices are making such projects more economically attractive. At first glance, this may appear to be a positive development, but the challenge lies in timing. Building new wind and solar capacity along with the necessary transmission infrastructure takes years to complete. During this transition period, natural gas prices are likely to remain elevated, continuing to place pressure on households and businesses alike. International partners, particularly in Europe, are watching these developments closely. Germany's chancellor noted in a speech in December 2025 that instability in the North American energy market serves as a stark reminder of the importance of diversifying energy supplies. That is diplomatic language for saying that Europe can no longer place full confidence in the stability of the US-Canada energy axis, when President Trump's tariffs are undermining the foundations of that relationship. And as such signals become more frequent, warnings from analysts and energy experts are growing increasingly urgent. On January 5, 2026, Eurasia Group released its 2026 Global Risks Report, devoting significant attention to Canada to US relations. One key assessment in the report stated that Prime Minister Carney would face substantial obstacles in persuading counterparts to accept concessions on market access or defense procurement, because such moves would likely be interpreted by President Trump as political victories. While acknowledging that Prime Minister Carney's diversification strategy carries risks, The report emphasized that President Trump's tariff-based approach has inadvertently accelerated rather than restrained Canada's shift away from dependence on the United States. Energy economist Philip Verlager, who accurately anticipated the oil price shocks of 2008, issued a similar warning in an analysis published in January 2026. He argued that the United States is unintentionally drifting into a dangerous position, as its most reliable energy partner has already begun to significantly scale back its engagement with the U.S. market. The consequences, he warned, would be price volatility and supply constraints that tariffs themselves cannot resolve. And the ripple effects of this process extend beyond economics, spilling into the political realm as well. Several governors from states with high natural gas consumption, including Republican governors in Ohio and Pennsylvania, have reportedly expressed dissatisfaction in private discussions with the White House. They argue that President Trump's tariff strategy is proving counterproductive in ways that directly harm their local constituents. Gradually, a candid assessment is taking shape among analysts and policymakers alike. President Trump's leverage over Canada has fundamentally changed, and that change does not favor the United States.